Hello everyone and welcome to The Perfect Sauce, the series where I learn I've been mispronouncing Ifrit for my entire life.
Ifrit, I need Ifrit.
Today we are talking about Final Fantasy XVI, the JRPG where Clive Rossfield attempts to save the world from horrible side quests. Now the series itself is a classic, instantly recognizable within the gaming landscape because of years and years of rich storytelling, engaging gameplay, and villains that can't really explain themselves in a comprehensive way.
What are you saying?
Starting out as a modest turn-based game, recent years have seen the series switch towards a more cinematic and energetic hack-and-slash experience, and Final Fantasy XVI is no different, aiming to elevate its cinematic storytelling and flashy gameplay to new levels. I've obtained every trophy in preparation for this breakdown, at the end of which I'll be putting it in one of 5 categories based on my overall experience. Naturally, I will be talking about its story and mechanics, and because this game is still at the moment only available on the PS5, because platform exclusivity is fun, do be aware of massive spoilers. So with that warning out of the way, welcome to The Perfect Sauce. Much like most mainline Final Fantasy games, 16 uses a brand new setting to tell a story that is completely separate from its previous installments. And can I just take a small moment to appreciate this in earnest? It's refreshing to have a story that isn't chopped up into multiple games to make easy sequels, and instead have full focus be placed on telling a story that feels complete. It's just... it's nice, isn't it? Valisthea is a medieval fantasy land in turmoil, where warring kingdoms fight for power in a world beset by the Blight, a mysterious phenomenon that spreads and renders land uninhabitable. It's very much the sort of ironic dynamic where factions fight each other rather than work together towards stopping a terrible threat, while the threat is left to grow exponentially. Naturally, for a Final Fantasy game, magic happens to be a thing. The land is rich in ether, which enables the use of magic in various ways. Across Valisthea, there are several mother crystals, huge crystalline mountain formations that hold great power and honestly look gorgeous. Kingdoms have congregated around them and started mining them for magical crystals, which have become a widespread tool in normal life as a source of water and fire, for instance. But apart from that, we have dominance and we have bearers and dominance. Bearers are able to channel ether without the use of crystals. However, this comes at the cost of their own health, and is not helped by the fact that society tends to not take too kindly to them. They're branded, sold into slavery where they're most often overworked to death. The world of Valisthea is genuinely cruel to them, and the story showcases that. Then we have dominance. And dominants are special, as apart from them being able to command much more powerful elemental magic, they're also able to transform into icons. And here's how Final Fantasy XVI connects to previous games. Basically, there are certain constants within the world of Final Fantasy, ranging from plot points like the overuse of magic being bad to gameplay elements like summons. Final Fantasy XVI takes these summons and puts them front and center to its story, while also taking other recurring elements like chocobos, muggles, and a supporting character named Cid.
They never stood a chance.
Our main character hails from the western kingdom of Rosaria. You play as Clive Rossfield, who's Noctis but daddy. He's part of Rosaria's royal family, a bloodline blessed by the Phoenix, icon of fire. Now, despite Clive being the firstborn, he's not the dominant of Phoenix. Instead, his younger brother Joshua inherited that power. So Clive trains to become his brother's protector while receiving his blessing to use some of the powers of the Phoenix. This is the game's introductory sequence where you learn the basics of combat and get a vague sense of what the world and its characters are about. You get to know of Jill and her close friendship with Clive, the cute Papa Torgal, and Queen Annabella, whose first few minutes of screen time are enough to give you mommy issues.
Good day to you, Mother.
By the end of it, everything takes a turn for the worse, with the Queen betraying Rosaria to the Empire of Sanbreque and leading to the apparent death of most characters. You also learn of another dominant wielding the power of a second icon of fire, which is not just a pretty neat boss fight presentation-wise, but becomes an important plot point for Clive, as years later he intends to find this person whom he perceives to have killed his brother and take revenge. His epic journey brings you across Valisthea to rid the world of mother crystals and stop the Blight, eventually uncovering an ancient god and fighting against its design. So now that the tutorial is done, let's talk about the game's combat system, which I should note I will be describing from a PS5 standpoint. I don't know how it will change once it's ported to PC, but I can imagine some things may be different to make it work better with a keyboard and mouse. The combat itself is very much what I would call a product that is the sum of its parts, but not because these things have deep interactions with one another. Rather, the game keeps adding more and more mechanics to give you additional combat considerations and possibilities. Things start off pretty simple. Square is used for sword attacks and range magic with triangle. It's pretty basic and things may start to feel a bit repetitive, but you do have some other stuff to play with, not just in terms of iconic abilities but also magic bursts, which is this mechanic whereby timing a magic attack right after each normal attack enables you to deal some additional damage. It's not exactly the easiest thing to do if you want to get a full combo, but it does highlight how Final Fantasy XVI has these small combat details that require your attention for a small satisfying payoff, and it's something that I'll talk about in a bit more detail in the next few minutes. You'll soon learn, well I say soon, this is like 5 hours into the game, that Clive is special because he can take the powers of other dominants and use them himself. This is one of the ways the game keeps combat fresh, by opening up new abilities to you after certain key points of the story. Each icon comes with 4 abilities and a feat. You will eventually unlock 3 slots, with each letting you choose one icon which comes with its feat and the abilities that are initially limited to the icon you choose. Once you upgrade and master them with ability points, you can mix and match them however you want and make a loadout that suits your combat preferences. The abilities themselves are quite varied, but they kind of represent why I said that the combat system is the sum of its parts and not necessarily in a good way. Looking at these abilities, there's not a lot of things that really play off of each other. Sure, you can use an ability that launches enemies in air and then use one of the abilities that can be used mid-air, but it's pretty basic as an idea. Maybe it's just me playing a bit too much Genshin this past few days, but I think synergetic elemental reactions could have made things a bit more interesting, because as it stands, abilities are pretty separate entities from one another. What's even weirder is how even though these abilities are of elemental nature, the game doesn't feature any elemental resistances or weaknesses. It feels bizarre to just use, say, a fire ability against a being that is pretty much fire itself and be effective all the same. That being said, they're beautifully animated with fantastic effects and feel great and impactful to use in combat. Separate as they may be, they're in no small part the reason why embodying Clive feels so satisfying, and it only gets better the more you play. Also, I like how forgiving the ability point system is. You're allowed to fully reset any ability at any point and get back all of the points you invested in it. It completely eliminates any fear of investing into something you don't like and enables a lot of freedom in your experimentation. The iconic feats though I really like, because they play with different aspects of combat in fun ways. The first is pretty basic, a long distance teleport to get up close to your target, but they only get more interesting from there, like Garuda's feat, bringing enemies close to you or acting as a makeshift vertical dodge against bigger enemies. Titan grants you a block which you can also use as a parry alternative, which looks really cool, while Shiva gives you another dodge that if used precisely causes all enemies close to you to freeze. But then there's Odin and Bahamut, and they have some more involved feats. Mega Flare struck me as a bit weird at first because it charges pretty slowly and all of your offensive capabilities are disabled, so you're a slow walking target. And getting hit is punishing as it cancels your channeling and the progress you made regresses fast. But then I saw that dodging through attacks channels it much faster, and you can even exploit dangerous attacks by dodging through them multiple times. Mastered, it has 4 levels to charge up, which means that you need to do quite a bit of preparation, but the payoff is this amazing rain of projectiles that is not just beautiful, but deals a lot of damage in a wide area for quite some time. Also you get wings and Kamehameha out the sky. 10 out of 10. Odin I both like and hate. His feat has 2 functionalities. First is a weapon with a different moveset, and I'm a sucker for that. And second, its attacks charge up Zantetsuken, which has a different animation and damage based on the charge level. Its mastered version is genuinely crazy. It deals an insane amount of damage that kills pretty much everything in your vicinity. It's absolutely busted, but Odin's abilities are kind of a letdown. They are these flashy combos that look cool and charge Zantetsuken, but otherwise deal insubstantial damage. So Odin's entire kit is sacrificed to make way for the only real ability worth using. It's beyond disappointing since his dominant, King Barnabas, is one of the later and more difficult bosses, and the payoff is just one actual ability. One busted ability, sure, but just one ability nonetheless. Either way, I feel like these feats are quite impactful in enabling you to craft slightly different playstyles, especially because you can change them on the fly during combat. So, overall, these iconic abilities and feats make combat feel physically and visually engaging, and being able to mix and match them however you want is great. Let's now look at the enemies, and this is where I feel that Final Fantasy XVI runs into a very common issue with enemy design. You see, the problem with many action games is that you can separate enemies into 2 categories based on a very simple fact. Do they get interrupted by your attacks? And indeed, there's loads of enemies that are constantly reactive to your attacks and feel like they're just fodder you can very easily dispatch. They never pose a real threat by design, and their encounters feel very insignificant, even when the game tries adding some complexity to them like spellcasting units that can heal, buff, or protect. The other extreme is enemies that have a lot more health and don't react to most of anything. It's a stark contrast, and I think games have evolved enough to do better. Even if I were to highlight how some regular enemies can block attacks, they're still left vulnerable to iconic abilities, so once you have a lot of them, there's nothing they can really do to pose a genuine threat. Now the bigger enemies, which we can see are sort of sub-bosses and bosses, have an additional mechanic attached to them that you can use to your advantage. They can be staggered, which is a fantastic addition to combat for several reasons. First is the strategic considerations it opens up. You can see the stagger gauge right below an enemy's HP bar, and dealing any damage decreases it. But if you look at your abilities, you'll notice that the game distinguishes between actual damage and stagger damage. So you have a dynamic where you have to consider how much you want to focus on abilities for staggering, damaging, or even a mix of both. Once the gauge is empty, the enemy is left vulnerable for a few seconds. And this is the other thing that is great about this system. It empowers you by turning the tide of battle in your favor, which it does so intensely by also adding a multiplier that goes up to 1.5% of additional damage with each attack. And this multiplier is affected by stagger damage directly, so the strategic choices you make not just in choosing your abilities but also when to use them is maintained throughout. This stagger mechanic is an adrenaline rush that just got me addicted to reaching new heights of damage, always pushing it further and further with each and any new combat component the game throws my way. Truly beautiful stuff. Now, a thing you will have noticed is that when most enemies reach 50% of their stagger bar, they have this short interruption animation, and after getting Garuda's deadly embrace, you can exploit that, and it's really satisfying to just grab an enemy by the face and wrestle it down. But I also think that it highlights another thing that makes the game's combat so satisfying. It has these small touch-ups sprinkled throughout your combat interactions that reward your attention into detail in the heat of combat. Some abilities have a wind-up mechanic, and getting it right feels as rewarding as it does damaging. Then you have things that interact with dodging and parries, like Odin's Blade featuring a different precision dodge attack that has a lot of range and a parry that feels great to land. This is why I really like feats, they play around with your standard kit in creative and fun ways. Every deadly embrace, precise wind-up, parry, and other precision-based moves make you feel cool for performing them and being able to keep your focus during tense moments. The combat overall is definitely one of the strongest and most satisfying things Final Fantasy XVI has going for it. However, it also has one massive problem. Let's talk difficulty. Final Fantasy XVI is one of the easiest action games I have ever played, and what I really dislike about it is that it's done by design. From the start, you can choose between story-focused and action-focused as difficulty modes. Story-focused features weaker enemies and also equips you with special accessories that essentially do everything for you. Every fighting element is condensed to square, and aspects like dodging and healing are automatic, so the game goes out of its way to really hold your hand. And then we go higher up in difficulty with the action-focused option. But this mode still lets you use these accessories, you start out with them. As a side note, I'm pretty surprised how the AI is pretty good at using feats, but the presence of these accessories make the commitment to the game's difficulty really weak. That being said, the game never forces you to use them, so they are optional. I even made use of them for an optional piece of side content, and its time is coming. But apart from that, the game is really adverse in punishing you for failure. In main levels, the game goes as far as remembering which enemies you have defeated even if you fail the encounter, and it also carries over stuff like Zantetsuken and limit break progress. However, the most detrimental thing is the potions. They fucking reset! You start out with 4 normal and 3 high potions, and you get to upgrade their potency and capacity throughout the story. And without fail, with each and every single failure, they are reset to full. It doesn't matter how far in the level you are, or even if you're fighting a major boss, because even bosses have checkpoints. And if that's not enough, the game also supplies you with a steady stream of them after various encounters. You have to actively go out of your way to make this game so easy, that's why I'm saying that it's designed this way. Nothing in this game is made to pose a challenge, and I suspect it's done so purely so that you never give up on the cinematic story because of any slight hurdle. But because of that, combat is offensively inoffensive. Levels also don't really matter, which is a real shame considering how much of a staple they are to RPGs in general. They don't do much other than increasing stats, which I've had no reason to look at to begin with, and there's no limitation on any gear or even abilities that's unlocked via a separate resource altogether. But I believe that if I can beat a max level enemy while I'm 9 levels behind, you might have a problem. Now you might say, well, 9 is just 1 but like 9 times. So here's me fighting the same boss on a higher New Game Plus difficulty 22 levels behind and not having much of a problem. I'm simply that bitch. It's another thing that I believe is sacrificed for the sake of keeping your engagement on the story. At no point did I feel the slightest need to grind out XP, which might not sound that bad, but I'd argue that you'd never feel the need to even engage with any of the secondary content, at least not for the sake of XP. Levels are simply treated as a formality of the genre rather than an actual gameplay component. The game does have one more difficulty, exclusive to New Game Plus, called Final Fantasy mode, and to be fair, it does sort of fix the problem a bit. You encounter bigger enemies earlier and more frequently, and additional mobs are made to use spells, but crucially, potions are no longer reset, at least not fully. They will be returned to the amounts you had at that specific checkpoint. That being said, the game still remembers which enemies you've killed, gauge progress for Zantetsuka and a limit break is retained, and checkpoints during bosses can still be exploited to your advantage. The game's difficulty is intensely compromised, and it would require a complete overhaul, from levels being made to actually play a role to encounters being redesigned to be impactful. As it stands, this is sacrificed, again by design, to make sure your interest in the story is at no point really challenged. So let's talk about the story. The story of Final Fantasy XVI is incredibly long, with the first playthrough taking me about 50 hours, which does include optional content like side quests, and I will be talking about side quests in a separate section because woo! The story is this epic of Clive's efforts to save Valisthea, progressing from a story of revenge to one in which you go head to head against a god. You get to see how your actions influence the land, go on to form bonds with your supporting cast, and get some funny banter.
Well, that didn't work. I think we're gonna need a bigger sword.
How about we use your
What struck me is how weird the game's pacing is. Let's rewind a bit. The game starts off with a bang by pitting you as the Phoenix against Ifrit. While you could break it down to be a very simplistic sequence, I mean it's mainly spamming square and dodging sometimes, I found it to be very strong presentation-wise, with great scenery, beautifully choreographed bits, and frankly amazing soundtrack, a great indicator of things to come. It very much brought me back to the days of Metal Gear Revengeance, another game with over-the-top bosses that also sets a really strong impression from the very first encounter. After that engaging piece of introduction, you fast forward a bit where Clive is on a team of branded bearers under the service of the Sambrek Empire, being tasked with the assassination of the dominant of Shiva. This is the part where you have no context for this fantasy world, and have to pay attention to what the game presents to you so that you get an idea about what Valisthea is about. Things are introduced very matter-of-factly, because while we are not familiar with the world, the characters of the story are. It has everything. Politics? Check. War? Check. Sexy bits? Check. After a short action sequence, the game brings you to the actual introductory sequence of the game in the form of a flashback arc, where you get to know a slew of combat mechanics and new characters. The problem is that this hectic structure doesn't really give you enough time to process all of the information that the game threw your way. It's unlikely that you get a clear picture of what's happening in the world, as you're soon distracted by a whole new set of characters and situations. And bizarrely, this intro sequence ends in the same Phoenix vs Ifrit boss fight. Sure, it's very much extended and cooler, but it's quite a bit of padding. Only after that, you return to the present where you're soon reunited with Torgal and Jill. So the story was very much set up this way so that the reunion with these characters makes sense. But that is done at the cost of its pacing and your comprehension to the setting. And there's more pacing problems later on, like here with Benedicta. Let's go on a tangent about story structure. Freytag's pyramid here represents somewhat of an ideal structure for storytelling. You have a build-up to an event, the climax of that event, and a winding down period. Final Fantasy XVI's epic follows a series of such repeated sequences, which we could say are a part of a bigger Fichtean curve, separate events that progressively raise the stakes higher and higher. And that's indeed a perfect match, since with each event the state of the world changes for the worst. Bearers are treated more harshly, kingdoms fall. But what you notice in both of these storytelling structures is a distinct period of falling action. And this is important because you need time to process what's happened and what it means for the story going forward. So, back to Benedicta. You have your build-up, climatic confrontation, and then some time to wind down. What's this? It's another climax! Benedicta loses control and transforms into Garuda, who you have to fight. This disregard towards story structure results in a lot of mental fatigue, and it's not helped by the fact that you also learn that Clive is a Ifrit in the second part of the boss fight, which already was a big plot point since Clive didn't know his brother's death was his fault. This is a lot of stuff the pacing throws at you, and it's tiring. And since we're speaking of bosses, they frequently have a pacing issue within the encounters themselves. Titan, for example, starts with a simple fight between him and Ifrit, and it's fun, the environment is beautiful and the sense of scale is fantastic. You already fought Ifrit as Clive and you know how big he is, but Titan is even bigger. Then, the second boss fight has Titan become even more massive. The presentation really is top tier in this sort of David vs Goliath encounter, and it ends up in this amazing tentacle slam dunk. But then you fight Titan in his normal form again while both of you are falling, which is such a weird progression. It doesn't help that at the end you're shown falling from high up in the air, as if you didn't just fall into the world's largest crack for several minutes. It's almost like the cutscene is meant to follow the end of the second boss fight, as if the order of this encounter is just wrong. Same thing happens when you fight Ifrit, then Dark Clive, and Ifrit again in a QTE. And then again in the finale, fighting Ultima, then fighting this dark version of Ifrit in an amazing psychedelic environment with crazy visuals and effects. And then Ultima again, but more advanced. These progressions don't make much sense, from small to big to small again. But the pacing is also detrimental overall for a big part of your first several hours of gameplay. This is for two main reasons. The first is that your abilities are pretty limited at the start, not just because of limited ability points, but also because of how many abilities you can have equipped. You're limited to only 2, which will eventually increase 2 by 2 to a maximum of 6 with each icon you gain. However, you gain them quite a few hours apart, so the combat gameplay gets repetitive before it has a chance to get more engaging. But in terms of the broader story, the early game has a lack of direction. Sure, you have the vague plot of seeking revenge, but the real goal, the one about destroying the mother crystals, crops up after about 10 hours of gameplay. The game's pacing is one of the most detrimental things to its story, especially early on, and I find it so ironic how the gameplay is made to be as inoffensive as possible, only to highlight how much of a mess the pacing really is. Then there are also the times when characters are like, well, it's gonna take us X days to get to this place, which is sensible. This is supposedly a large continent even if the open world maps try to make their scale seem smaller. But the problem is that you can fast travel. So you have this really weird dynamic where characters know the length of a journey, but you're also able to just travel somewhere with a hit of a button. And you can also get distracted by side content, which doesn't carry the pacing well and becomes a bit silly. But there are moments where the time factor really matters from a storytelling perspective, but not from a gameplay one. There's this bit when you arrive in the free cities of Canver, which turn out to not be so free. Clive gets knocked out, allowing Barnabas to take Jill as prisoner aboard his ship and sail towards Waloed. So, their goal becomes to rescue her. But Clive has enough time to rest and recuperate from his wounds, travel back to the hideout, engage in a boring filler mission to find some missing component, and travel back. And you can also do side quests if you like.
Time loss.
But despite all this time waste, they're able to catch up to Barnabas all the same. And the part where they escape this gorgeous visual of the sea being split in half is also pretty silly. They somehow managed to run all the way back to land. Like, I get that Jill says that Ash is not that far away, but bitch, where? There's sea as far as the eye can see. However you look at it, the pacing is incredibly messy. And let's be honest, pitting me against a difficult enemy would not make me lose interest in this game. Taking me on this violent roller coaster of a pacing absolutely would. Fortunately, the story does get better gradually. You have stories that start to cross each other, and when everyone comes together, it makes for a really cool sequence that puts you, as Clive, at the center of its world. The stakes only grow higher as you eventually find out that Ultima is not just a figure of godhood, but the creator of humanity itself. It's an ancient and powerful race that fell exactly for the same reason Valisthea itself is in danger: the overuse of magic, allowing the blight to go unchecked. And you find out that in creating humanity, they essentially engineered a person with a perfect genetic build like Clive. His special ability to take icons into himself make him a vessel they can use to harvest an insane amount of ether and enable them to create a new world with their race revived. And this is nice in two ways. You're facing insurmountable odds in fighting what is by all means a god, but that threat is reduced by making Ultima much like humanity itself. Its race fell because of the very same blight, and ultimately, just like you, it's fighting for self-preservation. It's a really beautiful piece of storytelling where everything comes full circle for a climactic fight to decide the fate of the world. Also, I will say that the way the game lets you recap previous events via Vivian in the hideout is really nice. It's this interactive map and circle of characters that can be played with to give an incredibly detailed recollection of the story thus far. It's honestly quite well done for a component I otherwise wouldn't have expected at all. Since I've started talking quite a bit about Ultima as a character, let's move on to the other characters of this epic journey. Naturally, for a JRPG, character work is crucial, and to the game's credit, it's done pretty alright. Characters have distinct personalities, struggles, developments, and even different accents, which is great. Definitely a highlight was Jill's journey during the second Mother Crystal plot. She was forced to fight for the Iron Kingdom, this barbaric, dogmatic, and outright cruel culture that left her scarred. And when the time comes to return to her place of trauma, she changes from being this caring, compassionate, and soft-spoken character to one set on revenge as a means of outgrowing her traumatic past. Beautiful stuff. But then we have Clive's journey, and his is just weird. We learn that Clive is Ifrit when he fights Garuda, so he was the second dominant of fire he's been looking for. It was he who killed his brother Joshua, albeit unintentionally. He is absolutely devastated by this fact, though it's kinda hard to take this scene seriously considering that, well, there's a lot of meat. Even Sid gets a bit flirty.
Pretty as you are, you're not my type.
So after this, Jill and him return to Phoenix Gate again to see if they can find out more, where it's indeed revealed again that he killed Joshua, but Clive is already cognizant of this, and what the writers try to achieve is this situation where he has to come to terms with it. But he already did.
I deserve to die!
It comes across as this overwritten piece where Clive just speaks in second person, as if he's trying to convince someone else that it's his personal fault. It ironically sounds like him trying to shift the blame or make it more tolerable by projecting it onto something else. It's like when you do something you know you shouldn't have and talk to yourself about how you shouldn't have done it, as if it helps.
No! You know it's unhealthy to eat an entire jar of Nutella. Me!
You get the idea, it's too silly to be taken seriously. But what I take a lot of grievance with is the characterization of the villains. Overall, they have this problem where they don't feel like active participants within Valisthea. They just become active whenever the story needs them to. But on an individual level, the characterization problems run deeper. Benedicta, for example, is just shown to be a cruel person, showing no mercy and even killing her own if she's a bit pissed up. There's nothing that makes her compelling as a character up until before she dies, where her relationship with Sid is detailed a bit. He provided her with safety and now she gets introspective about how things turned out. It's such a shame how she could have been a lot more nuanced throughout her screen time to actually make her compelling. Wouldn't she be far more interesting if she chose to show mercy because she, in turn, was also shown mercy? But no, instead she's a character that has like 2 spicy bits in the first few hours with different dominants, and is also hinted to have been in a relationship with Sid as well. So, ironically, her most relevant character trait is that she likes sleeping with dominant men, which... same, but I wouldn't want that to be the thing people remember of me. She actually bagged like 3 dominants out of 4, which is pretty impressive. Then there's Barnabas, secondary antagonist and king of Waloed. He's a bit more in the know about Pale Mads Mikkelsen's plan, as he's a willing pawn. But you see, Final Fantasy writers have this issue where they make antagonists have really pretentious and needlessly philosophical ways to explain themselves. Honestly, it borders on nonsense. When I think of well-written villains, I immediately think of Infinity War's Thanos. His intentions are clear, his reasoning is clear, and his journey is so well done, he feels like the main character in a movie that has him as an antagonist. Barnabas is, not that. He goes on and on these weird tangents, because the writers have really mastered the art of saying a lot without actually saying anything. Even when he speaks to Ultima, they both just blabber on about strands of consciousness and... Wait, hold on. Why is everyone naked? What's up with Final Fantasy XVI having so many cutscenes where people are just straight up naked? It's getting a bit distracting. But there is this bit in the story where Barnabas splits the sea in 2, really cool by the way, and after a full boss fight, because you lose no matter what you do, Barnabas has the opportunity to explain himself a bit. And oh boy, the tangential gymnastics he goes through to avoid explaining anything clearly are of Olympic proportions.
The breath of the Creator still warm on our lips. We carry his light that we might guide the masses in his name. We are but mighty acts of God. We were created for you, that you might drink deep of our strength and thereby fulfill your divine purpose, as you would know. But you only look beyond the walls of your prison of self-regard. As long as you choose to ignore this, you shall never penetrate my defenses. Still, you may take solace in the fact that you are not alone in your plight. The chains of elision shackle all of mankind, but there is yet cause to rejoice.
Right, can I stop you right there? What the fuck are you talking about? This bit was actually inspired from this very cutscene, where Barnabas is asked 3 times to clarify what he's going on about. It's like you have a writer for Clive and one for Barnabas, and the first writer is asking what the fuck is the second writing? I just could not take this cutscene seriously. I would have genuinely appreciated Barnabas more as a villain if he could just be direct, say what you want and why you want it. It would have been so much better if you were like, well, I think free will. Oh wait, let me try to do it in his own voice. I think humans are mini poo-poo heads and our free will gives us too much freedom to do terrible things. Voice actress, bitch. And all of it would be valid. There's war, people sold into slavery, religious extremism. The world of Valisthea is a cruel place. Too bad the villains can find the fucking words for it. Main antagonist Ultima also does that, but he's excused because he's a godlike being. But there is this unintentionally funny bit where they stop referring to Clive as Mythos and say his Logos instead. Oh, you're not Mythos, you're Logos. It doesn't help that Mythos means myth or fable, which makes sense. Clive is, after all, special in his ability to absorb other icons. But Logos means logic.
Ooh, you're a rational being now, and that's bad.
Also, it's kinda weird to see how he sits in bed in front of a naked Barnabas. But we also get to see Kupka, so, you know, he's massive, and I'm not that mad about it. Wait, actually, I just remembered, what's the deal with this character? It's supposed to be Barnabas's own mother, but 1, why is she naked here? And 2, she doesn't actually serve a purpose to the story. It's as if she's important to Barnabas's character, but nothing actually happens with her. Did the writers just forget her? When it comes down to the protagonistic cast, the game is simply better, especially with Joshua and Clive, with touching moments from their reunion up until Joshua's death. Their scenes are easily some of the most emotional stuff Final Fantasy XVI has to offer. I can only imagine how fantastic villains could be if the writers had the same approach. Give them empathetic stories, stronger motivations, make these confrontations more than just boss fights, make these points in time sequences where one's will perseveres while another's journey ends. This is why I didn't mention Hugo Kupka here as a negative, because he makes sense. He's manipulated by Benedicta to be on the side of evil, his hatred of Sid and Clive is justified, and his breakdown after losing his hands and icon to the same person who killed his beloved is shocking. More of that, please. Now, I think I've talked negatively quite a bit about the game, and I do want to stress that despite me being rather pessimistic in my review, I've actually quite enjoyed it. Not just because combat is pretty fun, engaging, and hectic, but also because Final Fantasy XVI is one of the most beautiful games I have ever played. It honestly looks gorgeous, runs for the most part well on the PS5, and it's heavily cinematic. Seriously, some of these shots are genuinely amazing. Just take in some of these. And the action sequences look so vibrant and energetic, especially when icons are involved. But what absolutely warrants a close look is the environment. From a gameplay perspective, your play area is either in the form of linear levels or open areas, and they both look amazing. Let's start with linear levels. Despite them being levels that are, well, linear, I mean it's in the name, they really went out of their way not just to make the environment beautiful, but also give the feeling of expansiveness. In most of these levels, you might be limited to a single route, but you can always look beyond and see how these lands and environmental details stretch for long distances. This approach really makes these levels feel way bigger than they have any right to be. Ruins expand as far as the eye can see, underground structures look like they go on for miles, and mines feel like huge interconnected spaces. The infiltration of Drake's Breath is memorable because of how it smoothly transitions from a large abandoned mining facility to the seat of power of the Iron Kingdom, giving the feeling of an actual infiltration mission. And then there's the capital of Olud, a level intensely atmospheric that really gives off the vibe of a dead kingdom, being overrun with beasts and corrupted creatures. Much like its king, the nation of Olud is long gone, and you have to fight through its remains to get to the final crystal. It's a beautiful outward reflection of the state of the world at that point in the story. All kingdoms have fallen, there are no more kings or authority figures, just panicked people anxious over what happens next as the Blight and Ether sweep the land. Then there's open world maps, and what I really like about them is the interconnectedness and sense of scale that have gone in their design. These open world maps usually serve as a way to connect the hideout to places of importance in the world, like capital cities. And they are designed in such a way that they reduce the actionable scale of Valisthea in a way that isn't too diminutive while making it more reactive to your story progress. For instance, with each mother crystal you destroy, magical ether starts concentrating in various parts of the world, which is threatening because it can corrupt pretty much any living being, turning them akashic. Now in terms of gameplay, these Akashic mobs are no different from normal ones, but they are impactful story-wise, and the game commits to this aspect, showing entire villages being corrupted and its populace being displaced. But in terms of scale, I absolutely fell in love with these gorgeous shots of massive capital cities in the distance, and then the mother crystals themselves simply towering over them. It's one of the few games I've played that manages to make the environment jaw-dropping because of its scale design. And naturally, once you destroy each mother crystal, they're gone from the environment. The world feels a bit emptier. In fact, I'd say that from a storytelling perspective, the game nails the feeling of progression within the world itself. The ether floods and mother crystals are a few examples, but with each arc of the story, things happen that make the world feel reactive. The persecution of bears intensifies, purges happen, leaders die. Valisthea becomes bleaker bit by bit, but it never becomes fully hopeless as you work towards changing the world itself, and you relish in your small victories to push forward. For instance, Cid dies after destroying the first Mother Crystal, and instead of letting grief overtake them, the main cast transforms the name of Cid into a title that inspires hope. It's a truly beautiful piece of characterization and world building. And then there's the boss fights. Oh my god, the boss fights. Everything that involves playing as Ifrit is a high point. Everything starts pretty tame when you first fight Garuda, but it only gets better from there as Ifrit gains combos, magic bursts, abilities. But the production that went into these is eye-watering. The sense of scale when fighting Titan, battling Bahamut in space while combined with the Phoenix, fighting a god in this psychedelic nightmare of a backdrop, insane attack moves, aggressive energetic gameplay, fantastic soundtrack. If you listen closely, you can literally hear the game's budget fucking screaming. It's been years since I've last touched Metal Gear Revengeance, but the game is still fresh in my mind because of the over-the-top bosses, and Final Fantasy XVI is a game that finally gives it a run for its money. I really cannot appreciate the effort enough. Like, I mentioned the fact that the progression of some of these bosses is weird and at times tiring, but the production of these sequences is such a delight that the game manages to overcome that. And this is not to say that boss fights as Clive have nothing going for them. From frantically dodging through Odin's attacks, to the final segment of Ultima's boss fight having his attacks be sluggish, there's cinematography dripped throughout these sequences and it's fantastic. Just as well, many moments are beautifully emotional with fantastic music, voice acting, and nudity? Again? But the problem is that not all moments are that. Whenever we switch from a sequence that is highly cinematic, we have a lot of moments that are very clearly at the other side of the spectrum, like the hours upon hours of characters just talking about stuff. Their models just stand rigidly in place, and their facial lip syncing is worth a double sachet. They are so bad, they remind me of Mass Effect Andromeda, and nothing should remind me of Mass Effect Andromeda.
My face.
They clearly miss those surgically detailed touches that convey expression and emotion. And there are also some dialogue options I discovered much later that lack a lot of animation and voice acting altogether. A lot of corners are cut, and you just end up seeing all these corners throughout Valisthea. Lastly, there are also some other weird things the game does, and I'm not sure where to put them in the script, so I'll just put them here. I'm such a professional. Let's start with Cid's death and how it's very obviously bullshit. Throughout your time, you see these dominants do crazier and crazier things and yet somehow survive. Case in point, both Dion and Kupka consume the ether within the Mother Crystal Hearts, but Kupka dies and Dion survives despite being in space in his human form as well. Dominants also seem to have no problem using their abilities whenever the story demands, even to the point of transforming several times into their icons repeatedly. And if that's not enough, you see these guys just tearing each other apart limb from limb and regenerating like it's nothing. Meanwhile, Cid dies from 3 bullet holes while in his iconic form, which we know they can heal pretty much instantly. It comes across as cheap, and it's not like his demise comes out of nowhere. It's heavily foreshadowed that he dies, but the way it's done?
No.
Then there's also issues of cinematography intruding too much on gameplay, resulting in some cheap things happening both in your and your enemy's favor. The game has some parts that require QTE input, resulting sometimes, like especially in the beginning, into staggers. And it feels cheap because you have to work towards taking advantage of this system, and getting it through a QTE sequence feels undeserved. And at the other side of the spectrum, you'll find yourself staggering bosses and noticing that at some point they just stop taking damage altogether, because the game has these hard requirements of when a cinematic cinematic sequence must happen. And if that's not annoying enough, these cinematic bits also usually reset the stagger gauge fully. Like, I get that this is supposed to be a cinematic experience, but this design approach fucks around with the core combat component. And let's also talk about these QTEs while we're at it. I don't necessarily hate them, but I also don't really live for them. Usually, I just hope games go for a better component than rely on the old press X. The most positive thing I can say about them is that they're probably some of the fanciest QTEs ever designed. Not that it comes even close to the clusterfuck that is Asura's Wrath, but when it comes to these cutscenes, what does and does not constitute a QTE is really arbitrary. But the worst thing about them is that they don't really matter. Not just because checkpoints reset any sort of consequence for failure, but also because they're nigh impossible to get wrong. And that's true for the Final Fantasy mode as well, which doesn't show you which input you have to press. You have more than enough time to use the QTE's color coding system to get it right, and the one where you have to mash square has no fail state. I was able to go and take a piss while all of this was happening. Just for fun, I let QTEs fail during my second playthrough, and even failing them doesn't always result in a different animation. Like here, against the QTE part of the final boss. I failed every possible QTE and the game still went on as usual. Yeah, Ultima thwarted. Sure. Lastly, there's this bit in the finale where it's revealed that each Mother Crystal was actually a trapped Ultima, so you unknowingly set them free.
What a twist!
The problem was that I never really gave it a thought, and when I found out I was like, okay. You already fought a similar enemy that also combines with multiple forms of itself, but apart from that, it's really poorly foreshadowed. Sure, for the first time a Mother Crystal is broken, you get to see Ultima for the first time, so in retrospect, it makes sense. But for two Mother Crystals, there's no indicator that another Ultima was freed, while for the other two, it's done really vaguely. At no point there's a strong indicator that there's multiple Ultimas roaming around, despite Joshua imprisoning one within himself. They all look the same, act the same, sound the same. Also, their true form is revealed to be Ifrit, and it's a bit silly to imagine a society full of Ifrits just going about their day. And about characters looking the same but not being the same, the game does a lot of this fuckery in the first half as well. There's this hooded figure who Clive believes to be the second dominant of fire. Years later, Joshua happens to get the exact same robe. Then the original figure is revealed to be Clive, presumably a trickery of Ultima. But then, years later, there's another similar hooded figure showing up in Drake's Breath. Clive never meets Joshua when he's hooded, so the game does this only to confuse the living fuck out of you. There's frankly no storytelling reason for these characters to look the same. And here we are, the side content of Final Fantasy XVI, quite possibly the worst bit of this entire game. Let's start with the positive to kinda uplift the mood. The hunter marks? Love that. It's not exactly new content, just the same enemies, but if you want to fight something strong and cool again, this is pretty neat. And I also really like the fact that you have to search for them in specific areas, since they don't just show up on your map. For some of these it's quite exciting, since the game doesn't tell you at all where to find a mark. Instead, you have to figure out where to go based on their report. Like, hey, this one says to stay away from ruins, so you have to search for a place in Rosaria with a lot of ruins. Nice. Then you also have stage replays and arcade mode, so you have a bit of replayability if you feel like it. But then we have chronolith trials, one for each icon. It's these 3 stages with 3 waves of enemies and then a boss. And I'm gonna say this early doors, I'm not a big fan of arcade arena stuff. It often borders on playing flawlessly to a point I tend to find frustrating. It's easier to be far more unforgiving to the game and even spot issues with the gameplay itself. And oh, issues with the gameplay did chronoliths reveal. You see, each chronolith limits you to only one icon. And when I say this, I don't mean that you have multiple slots to use all of the abilities of an icon. No, that would be too kind. Instead, per stage you're limited to only 2 abilities. These abilities are not ones that you choose yourself, and it will often feel like the game doesn't give you the right tools for the job. And the game often gives you one of those really flashy and cool abilities. The ones that have a long cooldown. Which is not great. Because time. This is where the combat being a sum of its parts is really highlighted. Because the game limits your ability usage so harshly, the combat immediately feels boring and repetitive. These are the only times I use those special automatic attack and dodge accessories. I just wanted to be done with it and move on. And then finally, we have the side quests. Oh, the side quests. The side quests of Final Fantasy XVI are, pardon my French, the most boring fucking shit I've ever done. They feature a lot of walking, talking, and combat if the game feels generous. The very first side quest I came across had me deliver food to 3 people. Fuck's sake. You have an entire fantasy world, and the most interesting thing you can do is have me roleplay as a waiter? Who thought this was a good idea? Which one of you fuckers is it? And for some reason they thought this was so good that you should do it 3 separate times. I'm sorry, I'm losing my mind. The concept of go here, talk to someone, and then return is just not that interesting. The best thing I can say about them is that they provide some world building, but that's a low fucking bar. Whenever I'd have to undertake another one of these blemishes, my eyes just start rolling as I think of the space I'm wasting recording this. I was genuinely having a negative mental reaction whenever I'd see another one of these little green fuckers. They catch you off guard as you rotate your screen and make you think, oh no, not another. Oh god, there's 3 of them! They are everywhere. It's in part why the pacing feels 10 times worse if you're playing as a completionist, because this outright boring content hardly carries any significance. It's just filler to pen out for time before you actually get to something interesting. And what's worse is that some main missions feel incredibly similar to these side quests, because you don't get to do anything exciting or pertinent to the story. Frankly, the only one really worth doing is the one at Martha's Rest after the time skip, because it gives you a mount, so you can travel faster and also dropkick enemies with extreme prejudice.
Watch out, watch out, watch out!
At some point they will get a bit more interesting and involved with the story. They actually do contribute overall to the feeling that the world progresses with your adventure. They feature ether floods all over the land, bandit attacks, bear persecution, and even crises stemming from the leaders of these big nations dying one by one. But they are so uninteresting for the vast majority of the game. By the time you get to the later ones, you're already burnt out. They don't really give you a fair opportunity to like them, cause they've been shit. I often believe that if a game has nothing interesting to say, and it cannot do it in an engaging way, then some content is better left out. And Final Fantasy XVI really embodies why that is important. I did not need to go through Clive delivering food to people, or buy goods for someone else, or whatever other bog standard sort of fetch quest the game throws my way. I needed none of that. Were the quests with Lubor gaining the trust of his village despite their mistrust of him as a bear nice to have? Sure, but the production quality is dumbed down, the story is unconvincing, and frankly I couldn't care less at that point. Not only because side quests overstayed their welcome, but also because there's just more interesting stuff going on. Like, oh, I don't know, this massive fucking crystal in the sky? Final Fantasy XVI has a lot of fat that could be trimmed off, and I genuinely believe that less could only benefit the game. Get rid of the annoying stuff and focus on the stuff that matters, because again, there's stuff that is really nice and could have benefited from it. You have these touching side quests with your companions and hideout cast, and the game could have done a much better job at shining a spotlight over them. Apart from that, there's no other side content really worth talking about, which is kind of a shame. When I think of super bosses and how the series was pretty much what popularized them, it gets disappointing to find out that the game doesn't really have that. The feeling of discontent in seeing a weird red tentacle popping out of the ground, fighting a creature that is out of this world, mechanics that are insurmountable and engaging in difficulty. Final Fantasy has none of that, and it frustrates me because these ubiquitous side quests exist and a series staple is gone. Wait, what are they doing? Are they... oh no. Oh no! The gays! The gays are kissing on my screen! Final Fantasy XVI is a woke gay! Jokes aside, nice. Now, while I was playing Final Fantasy XVI, I actually got curious if the right-wing crowd has been going on tangents about how the game is woke. They are, after all, pretty well known for being easy to trigger with the most ubiquitous of things. To my surprise, I didn't really find anything of real substance, just critics being discontent with the fact that the game has a distinct lack of people of color. Which is fair, there's not a single black character in sight. But if you interact with the gaming environment, you'll probably know the frequent, I guess we could say argument, that games shouldn't be political. Which is applied both to content people don't like, such as the very simple option of selecting your pronouns in a game, to ignoring developers donating to anti-LGBTQ lawmakers or even cases of abuse. Because we should just enjoy games. And if we lived in the fucking Shadow Realm, which we might actually, this would be all well and good. Either way, this is something thrown out rather arbitrarily. It's not really about a game being politically charged, as much as it just so happens to cover something right-wingers don't like. There's plenty of political games that have not attracted such attention, like Papers, Please, a massive indie success and an overtly political game criticizing totalitarian regimes through its gameplay elements. Final Fantasy XVI seems to have managed to avoid their gays, while including the gays. Did you like that? There's layers to what I do, babe. But I was surprised, not just because it happens to include gay people, though that seems to be the bar when it comes to these crybabies. There's a lot of themes that are quite political. You've got crazy religious ideologies like the one in the Iron Kingdom, and the acts of the main cast are very reminiscent of those of environmental terrorists. You are basically destroying a massive source of income and power that is used in day-to-day life, all in the efforts of stopping the Blight, which is essentially a more palpable form of pollution. And of course, you also have slavery, which doesn't always take focus in the main story but has a lot of side quests exploring the cruelty of the system. In fact, this girl gives you one of the most memorable side quests. She asks you to find what is heavily implied to be her pet, but then you find out that it's an actual human being, a bear turned to stone because of the overuse of their power. The game is willing to go there, and I respect that, because something tells me that if these pundits would have the mental fortitude to replace, oh I don't know, say skin color with being a bear, some channels would make up to 10 videos crying about it. Final Fantasy XVI is a fine game. It's a lot of fun and I've quite enjoyed it despite being, honestly, way more critical than I thought I'd be in this breakdown. The point is that when the game is good, it's really fucking good. When it's not, it can get boring fast. Not necessarily bad, just boring. It's a game that feels quite experimental and trying to make its JRPG formula more cinematic in an expansive world. And it's honestly something that really needs a lot more refinement and at times moderation. Don't give me 10 side quests when the world is about to end. If you're willing to be more permissive or outright ignore some of the game's more meh content, what you're left with is a really fun experience. Great combat, cinematic storytelling, and the bosses, oh my god, the bosses. Final Fantasy XVI is some good stuff. In no way a perfect experience, but it's elevated by the insane production value going into it. What I felt were the game's most negative points did not stem from a lack of content, but rather stuff that could be better left out. It's easy to say that less is more and be rather ambiguous about it, but you have to be more aware of what your game does well and what puts its engagement in danger. Crazy boss fights? I live. Side quests? Take them out! Thank you all for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, give me a like, give me a subscribe, give me a bell, give me a comment. Help it in the algorithm, and the algorithm shall give back. I don't know what that means. So thanks again for watching, and see you next time.